Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for taking the time out of your schedule to come on and be a part of our webinar this afternoon. Just to get started here, just some general information. There's quite a few people that are collaborating with these monthly webinars and coming from the National Drought Mitigation Center, Dennis Toddy up at South Dakota State, Doug Cluck and John Ice, the various state climatologists, especially Jim Angel, and others in the region, as well as the regional climate centers, the Midwest and High Plains, NOAA's Climate Prediction Center, and also folks at Iowa State University. As a reminder, the next call is planned for August 15th, 2013, again, 1 p.m. Central Time. The past webinars can be found at two locations, one at each of the regional climate centers, one at the Midwest and one at the High Plains. Operator assistance for questions and answer period at the end, and that was explained at the beginning. And please do sign up for these webinars. It's a lot easier to get in on the day of the webinar, and there's a link at the bottom of this slide to do that. And these slides will all be made available by John after the end of the webinar and posted to one of those two web pages. So the agenda for today, I'm going to go over the current conditions in the region and also some highlights across the nation as a whole, an agricultural update with some good slides that are provided each week by the United States Department of Agriculture. I'm going to look at various impacts in the region, not just drought-related, but all sorts of different climate impacts that are taking place throughout the central region. Also some outlooks. What are we expecting here in the next few days, the next couple weeks, even out a little bit further, and then at the end we'll open it up for comments. So to kick things off, we're going to look at the June data. This is the statewide numbers provided by the National Climatic Data Center. And what we see up here on the left is our temperature, and on the right the precipitation. And what stands out to me tremendously on the left-hand slide is the temperatures in the desert Southwest. Out of 119 years of record, we see quite a bit of those numbers in the 110 levels, even approaching record warmth for the month of June. As you go further to the east, we see those temperatures moderate pretty much near normal, and then especially as you get into the Midwest, the Ohio River Valley, temperatures definitely were the coolest part of the country. And then along the eastern seaboard, we did see a little bit more warmth during June from Florida all the way through the mid-Atlantic into New England. For precipitation, definitely continued with a wet pattern that was started in April and May and continued on into June for much of the eastern half of the United States. And looking at all the various indicators I have for putting together this webinar, you can really draw a strong delineation line along the Missouri River Valley. Places east of there have seen an abundance of moisture through June. It's kind of dried out a little bit lately, which we'll touch on. And west of that line, not so well. You can see Utah stands out as the driest June on record, and some of the neighboring states weren't doing too well as either. So kind of a stark contrast from west to east. Again, some of this record wetness along the eastern portions of the country. And looking at the calendar year, another thing to look at on the left-hand panel is the temperatures. Many will remember last year just how warm it is. Well, we're seeing a little bit different scenario this year. A lot of below normal temperatures, and a lot of that took place in March, April, and even into May, kind of moderating a little bit now into June and July. But for the calendar year, we're seeing many states coming in with temperatures below normal. Then again, as you go further west, that hasn't been the case. Look at California, they're standing out. And then on the precipitation side of things, you can really see from January through June just how wet it was in the Midwest. And then that really explains the drastic turnaround as far as the drought situation in the Midwest as well. You see Illinois, Wisconsin, Michigan, Iowa all coming in with their wettest January through Junes on record. And then going further west, you see that quickly drop off, and California is coming in currently with the driest January through June on record. So again, this big contrast from east to west across the country. And again, I mentioned those temperatures from last year compared to this year. On the right-hand side of this screen, you're going to see the January through June temperatures of 2012. On the left-hand side is a repeat of the temperatures from January through June of this year. And whereas last year we were seeing record warmth almost across the entire eastern half of the country, very stark contrast this year. A couple states do stand out as being warm both years, and look at California again, they really do stand out. But as you go into the central portion of the state, much of the central region of the Weather Service, you see that these temperatures this year are just drastically different than what we saw last year, and that has helped conditions out quite a bit. Some of the significant events that were posted by the National Climatic Data Center with the June report are listed on this slide, and I highlighted a couple of them in the red circles. And the left-hand one, talking about the wildfires out in Colorado, they had over 1.2 million acres burned up so far this year, and 500 homes destroyed. And so not a good situation, not only in Colorado, but in other states in the western U.S. dealing with fires. And then in the central part of the country, we're talking about Iowa, Illinois, Michigan, Wisconsin had a record wet first half of the year, and drought was eradicated east of the Mississippi River. And I think I mentioned earlier, we could probably even push that further to the west and say east of the Missouri River, because we have had some further improvement, especially in the northern plains over the last month or so. So some specific numbers here going into the growing season. Looking at this, I know not everyone's growing season starts April 1st, and especially this year, I know it did not start April 1st for many of these areas because of the cool, wet conditions. But climatologically, we typically look at this date as the start of the growing season as far as conditions go. And what we're looking at here is a departure of normal precipitation. You can see that through much of the Midwest, along the Mississippi and Missouri River basins, we see a lot of those areas that are anywhere from 5 to 10, even 10 to 15 inches above normal since April 1st. But you see it really drops off as you go further west, and some areas are actually showing deficits anywhere from 0 to 5 inches or even 5 to 10 inches since April 1st. So it hasn't impacted all areas equally. And looking at the percent of normal during this time, you can see, just follow that Missouri River Basin line, and you can see east of that line, you're looking at anywhere from 110 to upwards 150, 200% of normal precipitation since April 1st. And west of that line, you're seeing areas that are anywhere from 25 to 50, even less than 25% of normal during that time. So it's a very good situation where you have the haves and have-nots as far as who has received precipitation and who hasn't. Year-to-date precipitation, we're looking at anywhere from 100 and 110% right along the Missouri River Basin. The further you go east into eastern Iowa and Illinois, Wisconsin, you're up to 130, 150% of normal. But then you look at places in western Kansas, 25 to 50% of normal. Parts of eastern Colorado, 25% of normal. Western Nebraska, most of Wyoming, again, very similar conditions. You look at the headwaters of the Missouri, though, up in North Dakota and Montana, and you're seeing 150, 200% of normal for the calendar year. So again, the areas that have picked up precipitation have picked it up on very high levels, and those that have missed out just continue to stay in that drought situation. Departure of normal precipitation over the last 12 months, and what we're looking at is anywhere from 4 to 8 inches, some places 8 to 12, just depending on where you're at in Nebraska and South Dakota and parts of Kansas, even upwards of 16 inches below normal. Then you see that delineation line coming from eastern South Dakota into central Iowa, into parts of central Missouri, where they're hanging on right at normal, maybe slightly below, slightly above. You go east of that line, you start seeing those departures over the last 12 months, anywhere from 4 to 8, 8 to 12 inches. And that's how we really eradicated the drought over the Midwest. It really started last fall with, I think, Tropical Storm Isaac came up through Missouri and Illinois and parts of Indiana, and then we had a fairly good spring and into summer. So we really saw two scenarios where drought developed rapidly last year and intensified just as rapidly, and we see this rapid improvement, which is very non-characteristic of most drought events. The last 30 days, though, what we've seen is conditions really starkly different than what we have had for most of the last several months. Again, this is precipitation over the last 30 days. places in Nebraska, western South Dakota, only an inch, maybe 2 inches during that time frame. The further west you go into Wyoming and Colorado, less than 1 inch, maybe even less than a half inch in places. And even into parts of Iowa and Missouri and Illinois, where they have had an abundance of moisture up until the middle part of June, things have dried out quite a bit, and we do see only 2 to 4 inches of moisture during that time frame, and that's kind of put the brakes on some of this improvement we've seen, and actually seen some areas kind of tinkering on some drought developing here. Just looking at this as a percent of normals, you can really see that area from western Iowa through eastern Nebraska and eastern Kansas, western Missouri, less than 50%, in some of those areas even less than 25% of normal. Further north in the northeast part of South Dakota and into parts of Minnesota and Wisconsin, they have had decent precipitation over the last month, so they're doing okay. And in the west, it's been a mixed bag. The precipitation that has come up has been spotty, and the downside of it is some of those areas that have picked up precipitation, they've also started fires with the lightning. So it's a very difficult situation through the western edges of the region right now. Again, I'm just going to highlight the last 2 weeks, and you can really see the areas that have not picked up that precipitation. And again, that Missouri River Basin really stands out to me. For the most part, if you're west of that line, outside of areas in North Dakota and Montana, things have really dried out over the last couple weeks, 50 to 70% of normal through much of that region. As you get into Iowa, eastern South Dakota, eastern North Dakota, through central Missouri, about 90 to 100% of normal. So it's been hit and miss types of showers over the last, this is the last year. I'm sorry, this one's still showing the last year. Have the wrong slide in there instead of the last 2 weeks. So again, we'll go past this slide. I apologize for that. And departure from normal temperatures here over the last couple weeks, that makes a little more sense than the precipitation I was showing. But anyway, what we're looking at here is, again, the areas that are picking up the rain you see through Missouri, southern Illinois, Indiana, Kentucky, temperatures are well below normal, anywhere from 2 to 4 degrees below normal. The upper Midwest has really warmed up during this time compared to what they have been for much of this year, but still only 2 to 4 degrees above normal over the last couple weeks. And through much of Iowa, Nebraska, Kansas, anywhere from just 0 to 2 degrees above normal, a few areas of 2 to 4 degrees above normal, but the West has definitely been warmer. You look through Montana, Wyoming, Colorado, and you see most areas anywhere from 2 to 6 degrees above normal over the last couple weeks. But this has really been some of the first real heat throughout the region, especially the northern plains and the western portions that we've seen this year. Looking at the soil moisture conditions through the region, areas that have picked up that precipitation we see through central Iowa, Wisconsin, eastern Minnesota, into Illinois, into Kentucky, Ohio, even Indiana. Most of the soil moisture readings are fairly normal, and this is the top meter of soil. So what we're looking at is the area that's really impacting crops. And areas in the central to eastern part of the Corn Belt are really favorable right now as far as this product. As you go further west, though, you do see that some areas are very problematic, and most of those areas just did not see recovery from the drought of 2012, and this is carry over into 2013. Most of the areas that are showing up is less than 5% of their holding capacity right now are areas that did not pick up those spring rains in April and May and have stayed dry through June and July. And you can see that areas through central Nebraska, eastern Colorado, western Kansas, down into Oklahoma, even portions of eastern Wyoming. There's still quite a bit of deficit as far as that top 1 meter of soil. One advantage to this is when you do see those thunderstorms, even when they are heavy, there hasn't been a lot of runoff component to them. So the flood risk has been fairly low through this region through much of the summer. Today's U.S. drought monitor that was released, we can look at the country as a whole. What we're seeing is, again, follow that Missouri River line, and pretty much outside of a few areas in Arkansas, if you're looking at that area from Montana down through central Missouri, east of there, we're not talking about any kind of dryness or drought conditions at all. And this is in stark contrast to where we were last year at this time, where we were looking at drought conditions all the way from Ohio to Nebraska, Wyoming, Colorado. As it stayed wet to the east, most of those areas have been eradicated of any dryness. The further west you go, we do see that gradient of drought set up fairly tight, fairly consistent to where we were a year ago. But not as widespread yet at this point. We do see a lot of drought in the western U.S. that was not there last year at all. And again, this is due to the very dry winter and spring that they have had, as well as the above normal temperatures through most of that time frame as well. Looking at some of the statistics for the region, currently the central region, which is depicted on this map, about 32% of the region is in drought right now, and only about 3.5% in any D4 drought, and most of that, or all of that, is actually confined to Kansas, Nebraska, and Colorado. At the start of the calendar year, we were right at 69% of the region in drought, so we've almost cut that in half. A little more than half in the last six and a half months. And a year ago, we were at 72, almost 73% of the region in drought. So just a stark contrast again from where we were last July at this time to where we currently are. A little bit of caution on this, though, is a lot of the memory of that drought of 2012 is still ingrained in some of these areas that have just been on the edge of receiving enough moisture to carry them through, and those that have not. So if we continue to see this dry and warm weather continue through some of these areas that are currently drought-free or abnormally dry, the likelihood of seeing those areas intensify or even be acknowledged on the drought monitor map over the next several weeks is quite high, unless we see a change in the pattern that we've been stuck in over about the last 4 to 6 weeks. And now these are the slides that come from U.S. Department of Agriculture, the World Agricultural Outlook Board. And they put these out each week after the release of the U.S. Drought Monitor, and I think they're a very good tool to look at just the crop regions of the United States and how drought is impacting them. The first one is looking at the corn areas experiencing drought. Currently, 17% of the corn grown in the U.S. is within one of the drought areas as depicted on today's map, and you can see the major areas in dark green and the minor areas in light green. So you can see that compared to last year to this year, much of the Corn Belt is in fairly good shape, a lot of carryover of the springtime moisture in those soils, and again, temperatures haven't been anything unusual, fairly typical summer through much of the region. Further west you go, it is a different story. Looking at the soybean areas, about right now 9% of the soybeans grown in the U.S. are within a drought region. And again, we can follow those soybean areas up the Mississippi River through the Midwest and up into the upper Midwest. And again, most areas are doing fairly well as far as the soybean areas. Again, this is reflected on today's U.S. Drought Monitor map. Hay areas are continuing to be a problem, especially in the western U.S., and hay stocks over the last couple of years have just really been depleted. So most areas that are typically producing quite a bit of hay or even exporting hay out of their regions have been hit fairly hard with the drought over the last couple of years. Right now, 35% of the domestic hay acreage is within an area experiencing drought, and these are highlighted with the major and minor areas, again, in the dark and light green. And associated with hay are the cattle areas. Right now, almost half of the domestic cattle inventory is experiencing drought. And most of that, again, if you follow from Nebraska, western South Dakota, western and central Kansas, and into portions of Texas and Oklahoma and westward, you're seeing a lot of those major cattle-producing areas are suffering from a continuation of drought. In portions of Texas and Oklahoma and New Mexico, we're talking 3+ years now of drought. As winter wheat harvest is moving further to the north, we're still seeing about half of the winter wheat that's grown in the country experiencing drought conditions. Much of the harvest through Kansas and into Nebraska is winding up, and so we're looking at more of those northern areas. And again, they are not doing as bad as their neighbors to the south. So I think as we see that wheat harvest move further to the north, we're going to see some better numbers as far as yield and acres harvested compared to last year even. The last part of the webinar, I'm going to look at some regional climatic impacts, and not just drought focus, but just some of the things that are happening in the region that should be highlighted because of their relationship to the weather and climate that is taking place. The first one I've kind of briefly talked about already is the fire potential. And this is coming out of the National Integrated Fire Center in Boise, Idaho, their significant wildland fire potential outlook. And you can see, again, most of the eastern half of the country, even in the central part of the country, is normal or below normal as far as the potential for significant wildland fires. And this is for July. And as you go further west, again, things slightly change. Again, in the summertime, you have a typical fire season in the western U.S. that with or without drought, you're going to have fires. But what this is showing is areas with above normal potential, and a lot of those areas have been amplified with a drought component. Looking at the forecast through August here, what we continue to see is in the eastern half of the country, not an issue, staying below or returning to normal conditions. As you go further west, we see through California and the Great Basin areas that that above normal potential is going to stay in effect at least through August. In Colorado, I wanted to highlight this tool that the Colorado group has put together, and what was unique about it and what I really liked was their drought meter that they show. And this meter is in the circle, and it shows anywhere from normal to kind of in the middle to exceptional drought situation for the state of Colorado. And this is where they put the response to how they're dealing with drought in their state. And what you can see right now is that needle is leaning towards the exceptional side of things. And even with some of the precipitation that they've picked up recently, there's still quite a bit of issues in Colorado, anywhere from low water supplies to reservoirs being drawn down to the fire danger. And what I like about this page is you can go in as a citizen and you can put in your location, you can look for your water restrictions, you can look at reservoir storage, you can get all the information you need right from their webpage. And as a drought monitor author and someone who's looking at drought consistently across the country, I really like this page, and I wanted to highlight it today. Kansas's Department of Water Resources also puts out a fairly good product. Usually it comes out each week, and what I wanted to highlight here was just looking at some of the areas that were having water restrictions or different stages of conservation being implemented. And you can see that these different areas, anywhere from a water watch in yellow to a water warning in orange or a water emergency in the dark red, there's quite a few communities throughout Kansas that are experiencing some municipal water issues, and you can see some of them are encompassing entire counties in central and eastern parts of the state. So even you look at the rain that eastern Kansas, even in central Kansas, that they've received this year, it hasn't eliminated those longer-term water issues across the state. And you can go to the Kansas Water Development Board's page and find out more information on this as well. Here in Nebraska, we had a pretty unique occurrence here last week with a very high level of cattle loss due to heat in portions of eastern Nebraska. It was determined that within a 1 to 9 mile wide area in the central to northeast part of the state, that an estimated at least 3,000 head of cattle died within a matter of a few hours on July 9th. They started suffering around noon, and most of the deaths were taking place between 2 and 6 p.m. And what the observations were saying, it was hot with little or no air movement, and it was humid. Well, if you think about some of the practices that cattle producers and feedlots employ to try to keep these cattle at a comfortable state during the summer times, they sprinkle them with water. and sometimes that additional humidity in the air can cause to some of the heat stress that these animals are feeling. So again, it's one of those unique situations that everything fell into place in a tragic way where you had this large cattle loss. And I think it's something that in the climate and agricultural community we could look into a little bit more and just see what can be done to help inform us better about situations like this. In Illinois, there's been some impacts as well, but a lot of it has been from too much rain this year. Spring rains washing debris into Lake Springfield, where they have to go in and pull out tree limbs or even whole trees because of the runoff due to some of the heavy rains. And then highlighted at the bottom of the panel here is the delays in planting and crop development. And if you look at the corn crop emerging in Illinois, the 2013 is in the red line, the 5-year average is in the black line, and you can see that throughout the entire growing season it's trended well below the 5-year average, and even compared to last year where things started so much more quickly with early planting, early development and that. And what we're seeing is a stark contrast to last year and this year, and even below the 5-year average. And then also looking at the silking, and that's really the start of the pollination period within the corn crop development. And we can see that last year at this time we had about 70-75% of the corn crop in Illinois had started silking, where currently we're only about 10 to 20% of that crop. And just a big difference between the last 2 years. And again, a lot of that has come from too much rain. And just looking at it on a regional perspective, again, this is based off of the 1980 to 2012 average, and so not the 5-year average for the week of July 10th through 17th. You can see that throughout the Corn Belt that it isn't unique to just Illinois, but most areas are seeing these delays compared to the longer-term average, and even compared to the 5-year average. You're seeing these delays as far as when that corn crop is reaching the critical stages. In Missouri, and it's probably not unique to Missouri, but a lot of areas throughout the country that experienced drought the last couple of years, is thistle problems after the drought. When you have your pasture and grazing lands depleted and really damaged due to drought, the first thing that's going to get growing, if possible, is going to be weeds, and musk and bull thistles have become a problem. We're seeing in Missouri that it's become to the point that they're actually reporting on it, that many tracts of land in southwest Missouri are inundated with heavy populations of musk and bull thistles. And what that does are these weeds. They basically are using the moisture that the pasture and grazing lands would be using to develop useful grasses, but they're being inundated because of the drought last year, and so we are seeing thistle problems throughout the region. And up in Wisconsin, we're still talking hay problems. The drought of 2012 and then too much rain in 2013 have still forced livestock producers to be cutting back on some of their herds and selling off animals because they're running out of hay. Last year there just was little hay development. Now this year with the wet and cool condition, that's not ideal for putting up hay. And so we're still seeing above normal sales in parts of Wisconsin because of the wet weather this year compounded with the problems of the drought last year. Now to the outlook portion of the webinar. Looking at the 5-day temperature outlook here on the upper right-hand panel, we see most of the country is right around that normal area, slightly below normal in Dakotas, northern Minnesota, right at 0 to 3 degrees above normal, all the way from New England through the Central Plains, through the Midwest, and even slightly below normal in the desert Southwest. So right now, really no significant changes as far as seeing any large areas of above or below normal temperatures during this time. And that makes a lot of sense when you look down at the precipitation forecast on the bottom left-hand side. This is for the next 7 days. And what we're looking at is, again, that wet pattern. The eastern half of the United States is really staying wet during this time. You see some of these areas maybe approaching 4 inches of precipitation over the next week in Kentucky and Tennessee and West Virginia. as we look at the Midwest and the central region of the National Weather Service, we see most of the areas in the eastern part of that region picking up some precipitation anywhere around an inch, maybe even more as you get into Illinois, Indiana, and Ohio. And some of those areas, even in Nebraska and Kansas, maybe upwards of an inch of rain, even into Colorado. And you see that moisture plume coming into the desert Southwest. And the Climate Prediction Center has been picking up on this quite a bit over the last month to 6 weeks about an active monsoon season. And we are seeing that currently. We had the storm system that retrograded across the country last week, moving east to west down into portions of Texas and Oklahoma, where they picked up quite a bit of rain. Now with the monsoon rains kicking in the southwest, there's hope that some of these areas that have been dry over the last 4 to 6 weeks are going to start picking up some more typical normal precipitation that we would experience in mid to late July. The 8 to 14-day outlook, looking at precipitation in the bottom left-hand panel, again, the southwest is showing that strong monsoon signal, but the central to southern plains, they're showing a dry signal. Much of the rest of the region from Ohio and Indiana through Montana and the Dakotas, normal precipitation chances through this time frame. And with that is associated with the above normal temperatures that are highlighted in the upper right-hand panel. And again, we see the heat over the western U.S. really holding on, quite a decent ridge that's been established over that region over the last several weeks. And what we're seeing is that heat is slowly bleeding over to the east, encompassing more of the Dakotas into Nebraska and Kansas, and we'll see exactly what that means. We have had temperatures that will jump up for a few days through the region and be above normal, and then they go back down, and we're right at normal to slightly below. And that's very typical of late July going into an early August time frame that we can see, continue to see that through that time frame. Now, the seasonal outlooks from the Climate Prediction Center, again, these came out today, looking at August, again, that above normal temperature component over the Great Basin all the way into the central to southern plains, normal or equal chances of normal temperatures through much of the rest of the central region in the Midwest during that time. The precipitation chances in August, again, the monsoon signal stays in Arizona and New Mexico, parts of West Texas, staying wet over the mid-Atlantic and the southeastern U.S. And you see much of the country with EC equal chances. That's just saying that throughout this time frame we should be experiencing right at typical precipitation for August. The August, September, October on the bottom two frames of this panel, again, we see that heat staying over the western U.S., bleeding into portions of the central U.S., again, very similar to what we're seeing just for August, and very similar precipitation signal, again, through the August through October time frame. The seasonal drought outlook was also updated and released today. What we're seeing is drought persisting. Again, follow that Missouri River, and you can see almost any area that falls to the west of that basin is where we're talking about drought. Anywhere east of there, no issues at all, unless something really changes here, but it's really not anticipated. Over the southwest, we're looking at some improvements associated with that strong monsoon season, and even in the southern plains with the dry signal in some areas, as well as the heat that's going to be experienced during this time, we see some drought developing in parts of Arkansas and Oklahoma where we currently don't see that. Looking at other areas, the Hawaiian Islands, again, one of the areas that has had one of the longest term drought situations going on upwards of 4 years now over most of those islands, and we're seeing drought persisting and developing on many of the counties out there over the next several months. The 1 month drought outlook, which was released at the end of June, covering the month of July, and you can see those improvements associated with the strong monsoons over New Mexico, West Texas, parts of Arizona and Colorado. We have seen some of that taking place already. Some of those areas of removal, not so much, and then continuing development in parts of the West. Again, this was just for the month of July, and what we're seeing is some of those areas in the central plains and even into portions of the Midwest. They have been dry over the last couple of weeks. We haven't seen drought return yet, but we are on the fringes of it with the latest drought monitor expanding a few areas with abnormally dry conditions this week. So a summary quickly. After a wet spring and early start to the summer months, many areas of the region have dried out. Again, we were wet early, excessively wet in portions of the central region in May and the first part of June, but since then we have seen some precipitation, but not like we were, and conditions have dried out quite a bit. Second point, planting delays due to excessive moisture have also impacted the progression of crops in the region. Again, when you have those delays, it makes sense to see some of those critical periods coming later. What is interesting is just to see not only how late they are this year compared to some of the longer-term averages, but it is throughout much of the region as a whole. Point number 3, due to limited root development on plants in areas that were very wet this spring and early summer, stress may become a concern as temperatures increase and these areas dry out. Again, as these plants were started off, there was ample moisture, cool conditions. Those plants didn't have to push roots down deep to get to moisture. They had all they needed right in the first foot or so of the soil. Well, now as things have dried out, those poor root stands may cause earlier stress on some of these plants compared to if they were forced to work their way down deeper earlier in the year. So that's something that we're going to have to look out for if we don't see conditions change. And finally, temperatures in 2013 are in stark contrast to the record-setting heat of 2012. Not only did 2012 start out with an earlier growing season with a rapid warm-up and green-up in March of last year, this year all the way into May we were seeing snow into portions of the plains and Midwestern states. So as you compare both years, it has been very different. And the cooler temperatures so far this year in areas that especially have not picked up the most rain has helped to alleviate some of the drought issues and drought impacts that we were seeing last year at this time with, in some places, similar moisture conditions. So for further information, you can, again, go to the various links on this page. You can find most of the products that I talked about today off of these links. And here is my contact information, and we will open it up for questions at this point.
Right, this is Larry Bruce in Dodge City. Just a quick comment on the outlook for temperatures and precipitation. The EC does not necessarily imply near average. It's equal chances of above, below, i.e. there's not much of a signal that we can tell exactly what it's going to be, but does not necessarily imply it's going to be average conditions.
You're exactly right. It's equal chances of normal, above normal,